This is Martin Scorsese, the great Italian-American director behind Goodfellas, Raging Bull, Mean Streets, The Departed, Casino, Taxi Driver, and many more modern classics. Born in Queens to second-generation immigrants from Sicily, Scorsese has been vocal about the role that his Italian-American heritage has played in inspiring his films. This heritage shines through in many of his films, from the communities he chooses to portray, the stories he chooses to tell, and the characters he meticulously crafts. Another important source of inspiration and influence on Scorsese as a filmmaker was the venerable Italian director Federico Fellini. In an essay penned for Harper's Magazine, Scorsese writes, "Fellini was the cinema's virtuoso. At the center of it all, there was one director whom everybody knew, one artist whose name was synonymous with cinema and what it could do. It was a name that instantly evoked a certain style, a certain attitude towards the world. In fact, it became an adjective. All you had to do was say the word Fellini-esque, and people knew exactly what you meant." Fellini's films had a formative effect on Scorsese's career, who watched them religiously during his youth. He writes, "I came of age as Fellini was developing and blossoming as an artist, and so many of his pictures became precious to me. Scorsese was awoken to the way the camera could move within a shot, borrowing many of Fellini's techniques for his own. He writes that Fellini's 8.5 redefined his idea of what cinema was, what it could do, and where it could take you. While this formal influence is clear in their shared love of camera movements, Fellini also influenced Scorsese to create personal and autobiographical films. When discussing Fellini's I, Vitelloni, Scorsese recalls that the film directly related to his experience growing up in Little Italy. The freewheeling characters from the film reminded him of his own friends from the neighborhood. I, Vitelloni was a very personal film to Fellini, and it represented his own experiences growing up in Rimini. This in turn inspired Scorsese to create personal films that were directly inspired by his own upbringing, calling I, Vitelloni a pivotal inspiration for Mean Streets. This influence by Fellini is clear, but how far this influence extends into the deeper workings of Scorsese's films remains muddier. Did Fellini's ideologies and beliefs bleed into Scorsese's work? Did its influence highlight similarities between the Italian and Italian-American communities? These are all avenues worthy of exploration. One recent point of contention is the representation of women in Scorsese's films, or more specifically, the lack of it. Meryl Streep is quoted as saying, "I would like Martin Scorsese to be interested in a female character once in a while, but I don't know if I'll live that long." When promoting The Irishman, Scorsese came under fire for his lack of women protagonists in his films. This lack of women in his films is particularly interesting as the majority of Fellini's films have female protagonists. In this video essay, we will compare and contrast Fellini and Scorsese's portrayal of women, specifically the consequence of their different focus and representations of female autonomy. Laura will begin our analysis with an introduction into female representation in cinema.
Diverse and accurate female representation is integral to empowerment in cinema. Since Italian-American women are often presented in a negative light, it is important to break down the portrayal of these women. One way we can measure representation is with the Bechdel test, which asks whether a work features at least two named women who talk to each other about something other than a man. Sure, this is a good baseline measure that allows us to compare despite genre or timeline. However, we believe that the Bechdel test is the bare minimum for female representation in cinema. Despite this, many films in various genres continue to not meet this low threshold. In Jennifer O'Meara's paper, What the Bechdel Test Doesn't Tell Us, she discusses the rise in the use of the test online that, quote, reveals a certain competitive urge amongst users to find some vindicating dialogue, even if only a single line, which allows a film to pass. We agree that solely passing the Bechdel test should not be the main goal. O'Meara goes on to explain that, despite good intentions to promote female-led narratives, contributors to the Bechdel test may actually legitimize low, one-dimensional standards for women's verbal and vocal representation. She explains that by focusing on only how female characters talk and whether they talk about men, glosses over the real important questions in regards to broader complexities of their speech. She begs a few important questions. What do they discuss? When and where do they discuss it? How do they phrase it? How is it performed? Are their words acknowledged, praised, or dismissed by the other characters? Are their words repeated by filmgoers and immortalized in lists of memorable dialogue? We agree that addressing these questions can give us a better idea of how dialogue impacts the viewer, and thereby their interpretation of the female characters. It is important to note that this essay focuses on Italian women and their representation in cinema. Unfortunately, this means we are discussing only white women and white directors. As we are exploring the Italian diaspora in cinema, we must acknowledge this, as racism and prejudice are often themes in these films as well as problems still faced by racialized communities today. If they are even included, the women of color shown in the films we will be discussing are shown being exploited and heavily stereotyped. When discussing feminism in the context of film, we aspire to be more intersectional with our approach, by centering the voices of the oppressed rather than the oppressors. We recognize our white privilege here and the privilege of the Italian and Italian American directors and artists we will be discussing. This essay aims to open the discussion about female representation in Italian versus Italian American cinema. Let's get started by exploring Federico Fellini and his films more deeply.
When looking at Fellini's illustrious career, you'll notice that many of his films feature female protagonists. These women often exist at the fringes of society, such as the ever-optimistic prostitute Cabiria from Knights of Cabiria. In the next section, Laura will discuss Martin Scorsese's use of the Madonna horror complex. What's interesting is that the fringe characters in Fellini's films are often fantasy versions of women, the Madonnas, or actual prostitutes. The difference here is that the women in Fellini's films have agency and grow beyond this restrictive framework that they are born into. June Butler writes that Federico Fellini is known for his dreamy fantasy films in which women often play pivotal roles. The director sees female characters as essential to the plot and believes that they are crucial in the construction of the narrative. In Knights of Cabiria drives the narrative of the film forward. Butler continues, Messina, the actress in Cabiria, led viewers wordlessly from shot to shot, and also let them know what lay ahead was important and should be taken note of. Cabiria exerts agency and thus controls the movements of the camera through her movements and decisions. Narratively speaking, at the beginning of the film, Cabiria has not actualized and finds her self-worth and purpose in the approval of men. This outlook begins to break down once her boyfriend pushes her in the river and steals her purse. At first she thinks this may be a factor of dating deadbeat guys, but is again quickly disappointed by the rich actor she meets at the club, when he makes her hide in his bathroom all night after his other lover returns. Finally, Cabiria is introduced to the seemingly man of her dreams, who values her for her childlike innocence that Cabiria felt was lost during the struggles of her adulthood. She at first cannot believe that he would marry her due to her profession. This illustrates her own internal conflict with the Madonna horror complex. Only after he too disappoints her, stealing her life savings, does she, as Butler describes, find liberty and fulfillment through self-actualization. The film ends directly after this transformation, a common occurrence in Fellini films. This is representative of the freeing of the female character from the gaze of Fellini, as once the women are able to break from their patriarchal reliance on men, Fellini can no longer faithfully portray this actuality through his camera or his gaze. In her essay on visual pleasure in narrative cinema, Laura Mulvey writes, the determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female form, which is styled accordingly. In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact, so that they can be said to connote to be lookedness. Fellini is thus not able to present women in his films in a way free from his fantasy, and must therefore end the film once they actualize from his gaze. Butler supports this writing. Women in these films are portrayed as subjects of scrutiny by nearly all players, male and female, including audiences, who naturally follow Fellini's line of gaze. However, many women in Fellini's films do manage to cast off their chains of dependency and rise above their limitations. Their femininity becomes an inner strength in which redemption is found through resilience and force of character. Equally, they are allowed flaws and errors of judgment because only by making these mistakes can they learn, grow as persons, and achieve self-sufficiency. Another example of this agency and narrative importance is in his 1953 film I, Vitelloni. In I, Vitelloni, Sandra plays the character of an Italian housewife whose husband philanders freely around the town. At the beginning of the film, Sandra exists only in the world of her husband. She is confined to the role of the housewife, while her husband is able to do as he pleases. Her agency is regained at the end of the film, ultimately driving the narrative towards its conclusion, in which she leaves her husband and takes the child. This results in the shattering of his purely patriarchal views of the world and a beating by his father. The dynamics of the relationship redefined in a more equitable way, they leave together, excited to start their new lives. To return to the discussion of autobiography, Fellini states that in making Good Knights of Cabiria, he was inspired by the lead actress, Giulietta Mancina's humanity. Mancina also happens to be his wife. This film and its gaze thus reflect Fellini's own gaze in the way that he sees his wife and represents her in his own mind. This also begs the question if Fellini consciously decided to tell the story of a woman with agency, or that he wanted to make a film inspired by his wife, whose own agency and actualized nature bled into the narrative of the film. I would suggest the latter, as when asked about the political implications of the portrayal of women, he replied, "I'm annoyed by the attempt to be political in any conversation that should otherwise just be psychological or artistic. So if by feminism we mean the assertion of every woman's rights in any field, and the right to affirm her personality and qualities, which are often undermined and ignored, then I'm a feminist too. But if feminism means a pseudo-revolution in which women, who are incapable of being such, want to validate their ineptitude by turning it into merits and virtues, then I don't think this is a commendable type of feminism. It would be as if the crippled got together to claim that being physically impaired should be the norm." Conversely, when simply asked why he so often uses women protagonists in his films, he replied, "I feel like I've always been making films about women. I feel completely surrendered to women, their myth, mystery, diversity, charm, knowledge, tension. A chance to look into yourself. Women are everything." I believe that these quotes can be read in support of the idea that Fellini's depiction of women are a facet of his autobiography and not a political desire to present women in a certain ideological way. His films represent experiences he had growing up, as well as women he knows. His focus on female characters is out of personal interest, not born from a desire to elevate their voices and stories.
Some of Martin Scorsese's most famous work plays off of a trope we see often in films about the Italian diaspora, stories that are ripped from the headlines and show fictionalized versions of real people and real crimes. Two great examples of this are with Goodfellas and The Irishman. The Irishman and Goodfellas are related in many ways. Unfortunately, this includes in the way they present their female characters. Both films lack good female representation, and they both fail the Bechdel test. Going further, however, while Goodfellas does feature a somewhat independent woman in Karen, she's also completely reliant on Henry, her husband, and acts to fill the housewife and caretaker role while he uses other women sexually. The Irishman has come under fire for even worse representation, despite being more modern. The only female character, Peggy, acts as sort of a mortal specter, judging her father's criminal lifestyle from the sidelines, and she speaks only 6 words. This doesn't really work for the narrative. How can she be the moral conscious, but also not be present? Is that supposed to be some kind of symbolism for the lead's lack of conscience? When asked about her absence, Scorsese explained that he and screenwriter Steven Zalian considered expanding Peggy's character, but ultimately decided against it, and, quote, decided that she doesn't have to say anything. She looks at him. She knows he's up to something. There is a deeper issue going on here, more than the story itself. This is in line with the submissive, secret-keeping role that the Italian-American women have to play in real life, following what is known as omerta. Jane and Peter Schneider describe omerta as keeping to one's affairs and ignoring or pretending to ignore improperly the complicities and disputes of others, in part in fear of knowing too much. In Women in the Mob, Jane Schneider speaks about how taxing this can be for Italian-American women. She says, quote, "For women, this psychologically demanding practice of turning a blind eye poses a particular challenge, given that, as arbiters of family reputation, they depend on evaluative gossip, especially from other women." She says that this makes it more difficult for women to rely on other women for emotional and moral support. These women face denigration by men who, in building their own solidarities, horse around at the woman's expense, and they have to grapple with their emotional and material contributions to criminal activity that causes cramped interactions with others, including women, all because of this omerta honor code. Both Goodfellas and The Irishman present the struggles of Italian-American women without directly addressing them, and from that perspective, he represents these women accurately. We could argue that Scorsese is showing what he knows. However, by only showing this side of these women, and not their layered struggles like Schneider discussed, it reinforces the stereotype that these Italian women exist only for and in the context of their husbands. These women not only lack autonomy, but also agency within Scorsese's narratives. Now, it may be unfair to evaluate Scorsese only on these films. Since they are ripped from the headlines, we have to note how the crime stories that the films are based on also do not feature women. Thereby, this is more of a general Italian-American community issue, as well as a popular media issue. We have briefly discussed how the women in Scorsese's work lack agency, yet we haven't discussed his only female-led film, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, from 1974. Honestly, this film feels like a Fellini. It features a strong female protagonist who wants to pursue a singing career after the death of her husband. While she does follow the men that come to her throughout the film, her decisions remain her own, and she ultimately makes choices for her and her son's autonomy in the end. She takes back her power by the end of the film, and by doing so, takes the narrative power away from the men in the story, and away from the gaze of director Scorsese. We see a similar theme in Scorsese's 1977 film, New York, New York, which shows female agency when Francine chooses to stand Jimmy up at the end. Similar to Fellini's La Dolce Vita, the film's main protagonist is the man, but has a larger role for the leading lady. This is much more balanced than Scorsese's other male-led films. However, New York, New York famously failed in the box office and among critics, putting Scorsese into a deep depression. Perhaps after said failure, Scorsese aimed to focus on what he knew worked. Stories like his box office success Taxi Driver that are made for men about male psychology and social dynamics, and because of this, his future female characters suffered. Whatever happened, we can say with confidence that unfortunately, Alice doesn't live here anymore and New York, New York act as the exception to his female narratives, not the rule. We know that Scorsese has a big focus on the community rather than the individual, and that women are pillars of a community. Let's look at how Scorsese's Italian-American upbringing may actually be to blame for his poor representation with an exploration of the Madonna horror complex. Even in Scorsese's more Fellini-esque films, his male gaze is very prevalent. Let's look at his early Who's That Knocking at My Door, wherein the plot centers around a young Catholic man who faces guilt when he discovers the love of his life has been raped. The film takes place in a world Scorsese knew quite well, the Little Italy neighborhood of Manhattan. The lead, JR, spends his nights with an endless rotation of sex workers that he dismisses as broads, while he also turns away his potential fiancée for her past sexual assault. He is described by the director's series as someone who can't help fall in line with the community mentality towards women. They go on to say that the film provides provocative insights into the double standards that men impose on women. It has lost none of its relevancy considering today's problems with rape culture and attitudes of entitlement that perpetuate the objectification of women. This is in line with a lot of Catholic concepts that we see in Scorsese's early work, especially the ideas of redemption and guilt, but moreover his archetypal love story that the director's series describes as a man comes to love a woman who appears like a vision out of a crowd, promising to be his salvation from a brutal world. But when she fails to live up to his exacting, ultimately unrealistic standards of purity and innocence, discord most surely ensues. This phenomenon can be explained from a psychoanalytical lens. The inability to maintain sexual arousal within a committed, loving relationship was first identified by Sigmund Freud under the rubric of psychic impotence. The psychological complex is called the Madonna whore complex and is said to develop in men who see women as either saintly Madonnas or debased prostitutes. This complex runs throughout Scorsese's work, most recently in The Wolf of Wall Street and exemplified in Taxi Driver. One could argue that this concept comes from Scorsese's upbringing. The value of virginity is deeply rooted in the social and religious structures of the Italian-American community. This is another example of Scorsese showing what he knows. His autobiographical inspiration could be at work here. Like with the Omerta argument, only showing women through his lens, or moreover his Italian Catholic community's lens, presents many challenges for the viewer. Namely, it reinforces the idea that women must exist to please the community, read, the men in the community, which takes away any autonomy you may think they have. Ultimately, the use of this lens, and his gaze, destroys any agency that Scorsese may try to give his female characters within the narrative.
Next, me and Laura sat down in Little Italy to discuss the aforementioned patterns we noticed in these two directors. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Laura, especially with our discussion of biography. Like Scorsese is aware that he is not representing women as protagonists in this film or central to the narrative, and he's just choosing to make films about men. Like he's doing this like consciously. It's not like an unconscious bias, I would say.
Yeah, and we talked about earlier too how when he said like he doesn't have time to speak about women, it's not that he doesn't want to tell the story. It's just that he's not choosing that story. That's a good point.
Yeah, he's made like many films over his career, and and he's still making films at a decent pace. So I think there's still like a lot of stories central to him that he wants to tell. In another paper I read about Fellini, I probably mentioned this before, but he was just talking about how women were like really central to his life growing up, and like people he knew. Don't know if you encountered anything like that with Scorsese.
Yeah, it's interesting because Scorsese doesn't include his mother in his stories, like in his actual mother acting in a couple of his films, and he does present that mother stereotype well throughout his work. So it is a good point from the autobiography standpoint that the women he's encountered, his mother, for example, are included in his work, whereas it could be said that the women I said earlier that he's showing what he knows. So, yeah, it could be argued that the women he's representing are just the women that he encountered.
So does that then represent a more of an ideological influence from Fellini, that he took like the core of what Fellini was doing with his work, which is representing autobiography, and went beyond that to show what his experience was growing up? Or is he just ignoring the role of women in his life, in his films?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's probably a bit of both, and it poses the really fun question, which is, did he just not encounter the right kind of women? Maybe he just didn't have the same life-changing experiences like Fellini described, where women were so central to his life and his formative years. Maybe Scorsese didn't have those moments, and so therefore he doesn't have that story to tell.
Yeah, going off that, Laura, I remember one of the theorists we talked about in the essay, she talked about Fellini's film I, Vitelloni, and in that film the male protagonist, he is very hedonistic in his youth, and he is very aggressive and disrespectful, especially towards women. And after his advances are rebuffed towards an older woman, he has this, what she calls a gaze shattering, and his opinion of woman in his life, especially because he's married in the film, like completely changes, and the whole, like, there's a whole like power dynamic reversal between him and his wife, which I think may speak possibly to a similar event happening in Fellini's life that did not happen in Scorsese's life.
Yeah, the whole gaze shattering idea is a big one, in the sense of, we know that Scorsese has shown elements of giving women agency in his film, like we talked about with Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. But what happens, the men who face the consequences in his film don't have the same gaze shattering, like you described, that they do in Fellini's work.
Speaking of influences, besides like neorealism, Fellini was also really influenced by the Hollywood Golden Age, which I think separated from a lot of Italian filmmakers during his time. And so he combined that, what he learned from neorealism, and his own personal experiences to create these Fellini-esque films, which Martin Scorsese found so compelling.
Scorsese was really inspired by the Fellini-esque camera movements and altogether the form, I think.
Yeah, I think the formal aspects of the filmmaking is what Scorsese took the most from Fellini's films. And in terms of autobiography and characters, I think that was a big part of Scorsese's work. I almost feel as though it's more that he took the fact that he could make characters based on people he knew in real life, not necessarily the narrative arc that the Fellini's characters take in his films.
Fellini captures the essence of women. His characters represent characteristics found in all women and are thus more universal. These women exert their own autonomy and are able to break from the patriarchal mold present in the majority of Scorsese's films.
Scorsese presents a specific type of woman, one that fulfills the Madonna whore complex and/or exists only in the domain of the male protagonist. These women are unable to exert their autonomy and do not drive the narrative.
These directorial differences in female characters provide insight into the male gaze, particularly the discrepancies between Italian and Italian-American communities. The evidence we've provided also illuminates issues in female representation in cinema as a whole.
Whether these differences are due to cultural background or life experiences, only the directors themselves can know.